Good evening and welcome to Canada's Agriculture Day. Canada's Ag Day is a time to showcase all the amazing things happening in the industry and help consumers see the connection to where your food comes from and the people who produce it. Tonight's event is a joint effort from Dalhousie University's Faculty of Agriculture and the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture's Meet Your Farmer. During this virtual panel, we're going to discuss a topic every single person has experienced and I'm sure can relate to: the rising cost of food. My name is David Gray and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture and the Principal of Dalhousie University's Agricultural Campus. And I'm very pleased to be the moderator of the event this evening. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that Dalhousie University Agricultural Campus is built on unceded, traditional Mi'kmaq territory. As a place of learning, we pay our respect to the Indigenous knowledge held by the Mi'kmaq people and to the wisdom of their elders past and present. We are live on Facebook as well as YouTube, and we are looking forward to taking questions from our viewers throughout the event. Please ask questions. They make the event so much better, and we love the engagement with our audience. And we will address those questions as we go along this evening. Before we dive in, I'd like to introduce you to our panel of experts this evening. First, Richard Melvin. Richard is our very own alum, class of 75 with a degree in agricultural engineering. Richard is president and co-owner of Melvin Farms Limited, a sixth-generation family-owned farm located in the Annapolis Valley near Canning, Nova Scotia, specializing in the production of fresh vegetables for the Atlantic Canadian market. Richard has served as a director of the Centre for Small Business and Entrepreneurship at Acadia University, Feed Nova Scotia, and the Nova Scotia Potato Marketing Board. He has also served as president or chairperson of the Vegetable and Potato Producers Association of Nova Scotia, the Kings County Federation of Agriculture, the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, Horticulture Nova Scotia, King's Produce Limited, King's Processing Limited, FarmWorks Investment Cooperative, AgriFutures Nova Scotia, and the Annapolis Valley Farmland Trust Society. My goodness, I'm just tired going through the list. Ashley Mcdonald is our second guest this evening on our panel. Ashley is in the third year of a PhD in agricultural sciences at Dalhousie's Faculty of Agriculture. This is Ashley's third degree from the Faculty of Agriculture, having previously completed her undergraduate degree in 2014 and a master's degree in 2019, both at the agricultural campus. For her PhD project, Ashley is working with the New Brunswick Department of Agriculture and Dairy Marketing Board to evaluate the unique success factors that make small dairy farms in the region successful. Her research area is agricultural business, with a particular interest in sustainability and data-driven decision-making. Ashley also teaches courses on agricultural marketing and agribusiness sustainability with the Business and Social Science Department here within the Faculty of Agriculture. And finally, or last but certainly not least, is Gordon Stewart. Gordon is the Senior Principal at TMI, which has rebuilt and managed the Restaurant Association of Nova Scotia for the past 19 years. Gordon was founding president of the Tourism Industry Association of Nova Scotia, past vice chairman of the Tourism Industry Association of Canada. Gordon serves on a wide variety of boards and commissions related to the tourism industry. He has completed a long-term contract for the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency as the Director of Tourism. Some of the accomplishments are the design and negotiations of the first $18 million tourism agreement for Atlantic Canada, development of the Atlantic Canada Cruise Association, Gulf Atlantic Canada, Heritage Inns of Atlantic Canada Showcase, and many more individual and Atlantic-wide projects. Thank you to all of our panel members this evening for joining us. So without further hesitation, let's dive in to this interesting topic, which I'm sure is front of mind for everybody. I'm sure we've all seen it on the shelves as we've been going and doing our grocery shopping on a regular basis, the increase in food prices. So how about we start with inflation? Inflation is the sustained upward movement in the overall price level of goods and services in an economy. In Canada, the inflation rate rose to 5.1% and 4.9% in Nova Scotia in January 2022. This was the highest annual inflation rate in more than 30 years. So my question for you is, do you see a correlation between inflation and food prices? Richard, perhaps you can start us off.
Yes, thank you, David. The short answer is yes. I feel there is a correlation. In our firm business, we're seeing year-over-year inflation running between 8 and 9% at this stage in time, and we have to pass that through to our customers, which are retailers, and retailers, of course, pass that on to the consumer. The question is, historically, when we get inflation at Farmgate, we don't pass through 100% of that inflation due to competitive pressures in the marketplace. So if our inflation is running 8 to 9%, the consumer won't see that full 8 or 9% at the shelf. They'll see something a little bit less than that, but still obviously very historically significant in terms of a 30-year trend. Highest inflation that I've seen in my career, which spans close or over 40 years at this point in time.
Okay. And Ashley, what about you?
So whenever we're talking about correlations, I think it's important to remember that correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. Inflation is probably one of many variables that are contributing to the changes we are seeing at the grocery store. As we know, there's a lot of disruptions currently due to supply chain issues, the ongoing pandemic, as well as when we think about our food products or just the products that we're buying in general, there's a lot of different pricing mechanisms that can come into play. So some of these might be consumer trends, the seasonality of the different products, the perceived demand or anticipated demand for a product or a certain good. As an example, there's this old case study that I'll sometimes use about when the Heart and Stroke Foundation announced that they had findings that said butter was bad for your health. So then everyone was buying based on like margarine, whatever it is. And so that changed the demand, which then changed the pricing mechanisms that were in play. So that's another important thing to consider when we're thinking about the different products. So while inflation is probably contributing, it's not the only contributing factor.
Thanks, Ashley. Sounds complicated. Sounds like there are a lot of driving factors in there, all pulling and pushing all along. Gordon, what about you? What are your views?
Yeah, so I think what we find in our sector is it's the domino effect. That once something starts to go up in price, everything along that chain seems to go up in price. So the original commodity goes up, the shipping cost goes up, the holding cost goes up, the delivery cost goes up, there's a labor cost, and it just seems to do that domino effect. And it's almost religiously, you can follow that all the way through in our product range. A little bit like Ashley was talking about there, where the impact is it comes right along one after another. And we can do it whether it's a food product or we can do it whether it's a hard product overall. That's pretty much the nature of the business when it hits into the food chain and the restaurant sector.
So we've kind of started to touch on this a little bit in your responses to that first question. And so food isn't the only goods that are increasing in price. Input costs are going up. You've just identified that. So can you talk about inputs throughout the food system? And perhaps Gordon, we can start with you.
Well, it's an easy one. I hate to deal with this one, but it's an easy one to deal with because there isn't anything that isn't going up. And I think accelerated to some degree by the pandemic. There's no question about that. The impact for every sector and the restaurant sector is very much like the original growing food sector itself. We're impacted by everything and literally nothing. We've run into the perfect storm. So if you think COVID was bad, gasoline's going to be bad, electricity's going to be bad, labor costs are going to be bad, propane's going to be bad. All the supply lines are all broken. So any commodity that you want that's a hard good, it's bad. So it's a multitude of just, again, that domino effect coming right across the board. I don't think there's anything that hasn't gone up in the restaurant sector. It's a mammoth storm for us to handle.
Yeah, and I've just been watching the news today, and obviously the news coming out of Ukraine is having a major impact on the gasoline prices as well, and fossil fuel prices. So it's you're quite right. We're not out of the woods yet. Richard, what's happening at the farm level?
Well, similar to Gordon's observations, but things that are specific at farm level, and you mentioned fuel in the Ukraine, fertilizer prices are up, depending on the blend that you're talking, approximately 100%. Nitrogen fertilizer being driven by energy costs and natural gas costs, which are affected by the Ukraine and so on. 100% increase in 1 year, massive increase. Packaging materials are, in our world, they're energy related as well to some degree. They're running 20% plus. I haven't got my current quotes in for this spring yet, but I know they're already up 20% since last year. Transportation, which is fuel related, and then on down. Our lowest factor of increases is our wage scale, which is about 3.5% this year, which is still above base normal inflation of 2%. So when we mix it all together in our business, as I said earlier, we're running about 8 to 9% in totality across our whole spectrum of costs. So again, well above the normal 2% range that we normally would see.
Yeah, but as you mentioned earlier, Richard, that 8% is not being passed on to the consumer, but you obviously have to pass some of that cost on. It's impossible for you to be able to absorb that.
Correct. That's right, David. Normally, in normal times when inflation's running 2%, we'll pass on maybe 1.5%, absorb 0.5% through efficiencies and so on. That's when we're running in that bandwidth. But when we're running in an 8 or 9% bandwidth, we can improve efficiency by 3 or 4 or 5%. We can't do it in 1 year. So we're into a different paradigm here.
Yeah. And Ashley, anything from you on this one?
Well, as I'm not a producer or member of industry, I can't say for certain or speak to any numbers, but I think it's interesting that Richard noted that his wage rate was the lowest increase of all of your inputs. I think that's notable. And something else that I think is important to remember, while we may be experiencing certain pressures now because of the pandemic, a lot of the challenges were existing beforehand, and perhaps this was a catalyst. So the supply chains and distribution channels, there were likely flaws within those beforehand. We already know that a lot of the issues that we're experiencing are due to the ongoing climate crisis, which we've known about for decades. So it's not all unexpected. We may have been unprepared, but none of the challenges were particularly unexpected.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, Ashley, because what you're saying is that there were challenges before. That I suppose there were cracks, and we were aware of what those cracks were. But and so the pandemic's not necessarily completely to blame, but what it's done is it's sped up the process, right? I mean, we're seeing kind of a very, very squeezed time frame because of the pandemic. Okay, Richard touched on this, and Ashley's just touched on this as well. So, let's talk a little bit about labor, because a lot of people would actually think that labor is one of the highest costs. And, Richard, you've just identified that actually it's one of the lower. It's increasing, but it's probably one of the lower rates of increase. So labor is an important discussion in food and agriculture. We know about labor shortages and so on and so forth. So where do you see labor costs, availability, and the overall impact labor plays in food costs? So perhaps we'll start with Richard, because he's already raised it.
Right. Thank you, David. Yeah. Well, in our business, labor is our single biggest cost. It's about 38% of our overall costs on an annual basis. So it's by far and away our biggest single cost. Access to labor, cost is one thing. Getting access to people that can do the work is another thing, which is probably even more important than the cost. The demographic bubble that is prevailing with the baby boomers, moving through their age cycle and retirement towards retirement, etc., is creating a major shortage of people for all trades and professions. Agriculture is no exception to that. We have some unique challenges in agriculture. In our particular business, most of our work is seasonal, so that makes another layer of challenge to provide meaningful jobs to Canadians that obviously have to have a paycheck 12 months of the year. In our case, in most of the horticulture sector's case, we've gone to what we call a seasonal agriculture worker program, where we bring people in from the Caribbean on a seasonal basis as required, and that program's been in place for over 30 years now. It's worked very well for us, and we feel well for the workers as well. So that's how we've got the people to do the work on a seasonal basis. I wouldn't say it's a perfect solution, but it's the best one we've come up with to date.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And Gordon, from the perspective of restaurants, what about labor costs?
Well, labor costs are high, and as a matter of fact, what we're going to run into in coming out of the pandemic is that we're going to have quite an adjustment in how the ledger sheet's going to look for a restaurant. Right now, food and beverage is our highest cost, and that's actually going to be overtaken by labor. I will say that the challenge for our sector on the food and beverage side will be that labor will be more of an impact than COVID will be over the next couple of years, and it'll be no single solution. We need seasonal workers, we need year-round workers, but we need highly skilled workers and plain workers. So it's a real challenge to kind of combine that all together. And then we talked about the perfect storm in prices. Here's the other side, another perfect storm come behind this labor. And we're short out of our sector right now. We normally operate the sector with around 32 to 35,000 workers. We're down about 5,000 workers, full-time workers right now.
Yeah. And Ashley, from your perspective?
Yeah, so it's definitely a unique situation that we're in right now. As Richard mentioned, there is a bit of a generational change that we're starting to see within our workforce, bearing in mind that millennials are starting to hit their 40s. So I sometimes, when you start talking about generational changes in the different generations, we can sometimes forget that the millennials are no longer the kids; they are adults now. Something else that I think is really interesting, particularly from the production side, to consider is the sorts of skills that we're starting to see demanded in the agriculture sector. We are in the fourth agricultural revolution now, and we're starting to see a lot more technology integrated into our primary production stages, which means we're looking for highly skilled individuals that we will often bring in through the migrant programs who, oh my gosh, their ability to do the harvest and their speed and proficiency at it is unmatched. And then at the same end, we also are bringing in these robotic technologies, AI sensors, the robotic spraying systems for this smart and precision agriculture that has a completely different skill set. So we have that gap within what's available in the labor market versus what is demanded of the industry as we do that transition. I think particularly in the Maritimes, I can speak more specifically for Nova Scotia, but we are also in this weird situation where we do have a high degree of seasonality, which is not a very good job opportunity for most individuals. And we see that within the hospitality and tourism sector, as well as in the agriculture sector. And because of the socioeconomic conditions of the region, as well as just the geographic nature of the region itself, a lot of what we're seeing is the out-migration from rural communities or more tourist communities into the more urban centers, or the locations where there is a more stable job market. So that is adding additional pressure onto the already shrinking labor pool. Sorry. So we have those generational differences. I know people talk, we haven't, but people talk about these kind of stereotypes about the millennials or the Gen Z generation and the concept of work ethic and all that stuff. And we won't get into it. But we have that, as well as the gap in what we need from labor, as well as, what's available. I could go on, obviously.
We might come back to it, Ashley. I'm absolutely fascinated. So I just love agriculture, right? I'm proud. I'm passionate about agriculture. It's the most important sector there is. We all need to eat. And I think it's really important that people understand that this is not just about farmers and retailers putting their prices up because they can. It's a very, very complex business, and there are factors coming in from all parts and directions. There are many drivers to this as well. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up, and hopefully we'll get some questions from the audience, because I don't want to hog things, but I mean I could ask you questions all night. This is more about getting questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask you one more question, which kind of follows on from the last one, and it's a question actually I was asked just last week. In the grocer's shop. I was doing my weekly shop, and somebody actually asked me, and they actually said to me, why are food costs rising and minimum wage is basically staying the same? Okay, and I think that's probably a question in a lot of people's minds. They see food prices going up, but they see their salaries staying pretty much the same. The amount of money going into their pocket at the end of the week and the month is pretty much the same as it has been before. So, Gordon, perhaps you can start with that one.
Yeah, our sector is probably a little bit out of step with other sectors here, is because we started off with basically what people assume is a low wage, but there was only about 4.5% of people making minimum wage. But we also got to think at the same time, a good portion of those people were making tips. And in Nova Scotia, that ramped up to about $80 million a year. So that's a big price tag overall. At the end of the day, what we're seeing now is a dramatic shift. And again, that's the pandemic again caused that kind of adjustment shift that we're seeing, that the minimum wage factor, when we were humming a couple of years ago about $15 wage, that's now gone by the board. You can't hire anyone for a good example. In the city of Halifax, a restaurant just hired 2 dishwashers and starting them at $24.50 an hour, plus a $500 signing bonus. And if they stay the 6 months, they'll get another $500. So that's the kind of tactical shift that's happened so rapidly that no one would even begin to forecast that kind of thing is happening. And that's why I'm saying earlier that wages are going to take over the place of the first costing in restaurants. That's the kind of impact that we're going to see, a dramatic shift, which doesn't necessarily follow most sectors overall.
Okay. Yeah. And Richard, what about from your perspective?
Well, this is a big topic. We're in a global economy, and in the food business and the production side of the business, we compete at some level on a global scale. Our particular products have to go into a marketplace, be it retail or food service, whatever. And really the world is your source. And if we go global, $10 a day is entry into middle class on global scale. So that's obviously a low number for North America and the developed countries. But that if you're buying product out of China, for example, or Mexico or some other somewhat underdeveloped country, that those are the kind of wage scales that go into the cost of production. So you couple that with a market economy that we work in Canada, and in a free flowing marketplace, people have choices where they can buy their goods, etc. And on a global scale, all those pressure points come into each and affect each business wherever it is in the supply chain as to what it's able to pay its employees and put out a product that will sell in the marketplace. So that's in my mind, that's the reason there's a bit of a disjoint between what the wage scale is, the minimum wage, and what we see on costs of food and other things that occur from time to time. That leads to a bigger concern that I have, which is inflation inequality. And a study that was just put out last week, in Canada, if you're in the highest 20% of income bracket in Canada, you're paying 5.1% of your disposable income per year on food. 5.1% if you're in the high end of the spectrum. If you're in the low 20%, you're paying 21% for your food. So obviously, the people that are on the lower 20% are very sensitive to inflation. Inflation inequality is our challenge here, in aggregate in the food system, be it in the private sector and public sector combination, that we have to ensure that all Canadians have access to a healthy diet, and we're at high risk of failing on that mission, I would say, with inflation equality that's overriding the whole picture that we're at this moment in time.
Thanks, Richard. And that goes back to something that Ashley said earlier, which was about kind of socioeconomic demographics, right, Ashley?
Yeah, that's exactly sort of what I was going to build on. When we're thinking about our household budget, our monthly expenditure, the proportion that we're spending on food, whether that be in home or at restaurants, hasn't really changed that much since about 1965. There's just been a slight change in terms of the proportion of our monthly budget that we're spending. Yet in particular housing, that it's been a huge sharp increase where we're now it used to be around 19% and now it's at about 30% of our household expenditure. So the cost of living is obviously increasing. And when we think about how we're budgeting in the month, our food budget is the only one that's not fixed. We can't decide how much we're paying for rent based on what we have in our bank account, but we can decide how much we're going to spend at the grocery store. And the people, as Richard had said, the people who are most sensitive are the ones that are already struggling. And when we're thinking about the purchasing power of the dollar, inflation is an important measure to have, but I think purchasing power is also important to consider. And the more money you have, the less purchasing power your dollar has, because you have enough that it doesn't have the same value. This is a concept sometimes when I'm teaching my class. It's a struggle to get the students to ignore that money has value, because it doesn't. It's just what we've arbitrarily decided as a society. It has value, but it doesn't necessarily, depending on our situation. The other interesting point in terms of minimum wage and the cost of living and what a livable wage is when we start to look at the sorts of jobs that are deemed minimum wage. And typically in our society, we haven't always valued the individuals or those positions as we should. If we think back to the pandemic, what were the essential services? Of course, we had our healthcare professionals, but we also had our grocery store attendants. We had our fast food restaurants that were staying open. We had our gas station attendants, and all of those individuals were, for the most part, making minimum wage. So those were essential services, but we weren't paying for that service in the same way that we would otherwise.
Yeah, it struck home, didn't it, during the pandemic? Felt kind of it's shameful, really. The people that were the ones that were keeping the country running, they were the ones that were on minimum wage. So yeah. Richard, Gordon, anything else to add on that? No? Okay. Right. So we're going to see if there's an audience question now, because this is always the fun part. Oh, so we've got a question from Heather Rand. So great information. Would you be interested in hearing about housing challenges and possible solutions for restaurant and food service employees in rural communities? So perhaps I'll go to Ashley first, because Ashley has mentioned about housing and rural communities. So Ashley, do you want to kick us off?
I'd love to be able to offer solutions, but it's a difficult one because it would require policy change, and it would require social supports to help support those rural communities. When we're talking about, I have trouble saying this word, but rurality. So how rural a place is, we don't actually measure it by, how you would think, how far away is the next neighbor. We look at it based on the sorts of tax revenue in a certain area, as well as individuals that live there and the infrastructure that can support those individuals. So it's interesting, even though Nova Scotia is, the second smallest province, we are considered to be the most rural because we don't have the infrastructure supports required to support the communities. I noticed in particular when I was traveling in the prairies, and you would be driving for ages with no sign of life. And then suddenly you'd come into this town, a fully formed town. And I'm just like, oh, that's so strange. But then when I was speaking to people from, British Columbia, and they were driving around Nova Scotia, they had the exact opposite, where they were driving and there were just random little houses here and there, tiny little communities with no infrastructure, no support, not even a gas station or a grocery store. And they're left wondering, how are these people able to support themselves? How are they able to live? And yeah, that's really the question. How can we support our rural communities? And really, why aren't we prioritizing that? And unfortunately, with the nature of how we distribute our tax revenue, we put it to the places that have the most people. So it gets funneled to those urban centers and supporting those individuals. Possible solutions, I don't know. In the Maritimes, we are very reliant on our tourism for helping those small rural communities. So, the last 2 years have been particularly challenging for that. I wish I had a better answer.
Tricky one, isn't it? It's we certainly haven't got all the answers and all the solutions. Richard, anything from you? You're muted, Richard. Nope, still can't hear you. Wouldn't be an online event if at least one person was muted at some point.
Can you hear me now, David?
We can hear you now. Yes.
Thank you. No, just the only thing I would add to Ashley is when you talk development in rural communities, one thing we get into is land use planning, and you get into strip development, ribbon development, as opposed to consolidated development. And strip development is very expensive to service in terms of sewer and water. So most of Nova Scotia doesn't have, most counties don't have a land use plan that gives guidance on that, or effective guidance. And that's in play now. It's being developed now over the next several years to have more growth directed towards hamlets and growth centers where you can put proper sewer and water in, and cost effectively to do that. That's the point I'm getting to, is the cost effectiveness to do that with a little bit of planning. More cost effective than allowing development just to randomly ribbon development down the road, so to speak. So, yeah, thank you.
And Gordon, from your perspective, anything to add?
Just briefly, certainly the rural market for housing, particularly as it relates to the hospitality sector, has changed. And there's a couple of factors that have made big dents in that area. One is the Airbnb scenario that's happened, but that took a lot of housing out of the marketplace. Because people found they could make more money for part of the year with less worry and get out in the marketplace. There are some new innovative ideas around. But the other thing about the rural areas, that's where the kind of bigger attractions, golf courses, resorts have all had, and of course they have no population, so they need housing. So that's become the crisis area now. So whether you're talking about the Cabots or the Pines or all these resorts or golf courses, it's just compounded all. Some innovative ideas being done now. I like the idea of they're converting containers into these modular little small homes now and adding them together like a clustered little community. It's been done in some other areas. So there's some experimental things, but that housing issue is going to be with us for a while, I think.
Okay. Right. Thank you. Let's see if we have another question from from our audience. So Tyson, it goes without saying that agriculture plays an important role in our climate. Should we be concerned that rising costs will push away environmentally friendly practices? In addition, the push to produce more with less land may affect long-term soil quality in Nova Scotia. Is this something we should be concerned about? Okay, so Richard, I'm going to you first.
Thank you, David. Yes, that's a great question. In the short, yes, we should be concerned about that. We in primary agriculture, soil health is no question. It's under challenge on average. The idea of producing more on the same amount of land is equates to some sort of efficiency and economy over time, but we are attempting to. We're sensitive to the issue. The question is short-term economics versus long-term sustainability. In other words, if we don't produce a cash crop on that acre this year and we produce a crop that doesn't generate income but maybe a soil builder, we give up income this year for future health of our soil, which as farmers we all want to do. Most farms in Nova Scotia are family farms. They're multi-generational. They want to take care of that land. But the economic reality is also most of them have debt financing that we have to service, and we have to meet short-term economic goals. So we balance that equation as best we can. I will say there's room for a lot of improvement. I know in our sector, in the horticulture sector, we're sensitive to the issue. We're looking at more cover cropping all the time and various ways of getting that into our rotations and some multi-species cover crops and so forth. Moving over towards regenerative agriculture as we go forward. Those are things that are on our agenda, but there's a lot of room to accelerate that and improve that. So yes, it's a concern. Yes, it's an economic thing we have to deal with, and we do need. I will say, I'll put it on the table that we do need some public policy to help us do that, really, to be effective and accelerate it at the rate we need to do it. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Ashley, anything from you? Public policy?
Yes. I think that we already have some policies in place in terms of environmental protections within agriculture, of course. But I think something, and Tyson's question doesn't specifically lead to this, but if we're thinking about producing more on less land, I think we also need to think of why do we want to produce more. We don't actually need to. In North America, in Western civilization in general, we have an overproduction and overconsumption problem. We don't need to be producing more food. We have a lot of food. The individuals that are suffering from food scarcity are, it's not as though our extra food that we're overproducing is going to those individuals. Instead, it's being wasted. So when we're thinking about the environmental practices that we should be putting in place, we need to consider, the production demands as well as how we're producing the products. So while we can produce more on less land, should we? And is that the most, reasonable or future thinking approach to take? Because just because we are able to produce more doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to be able to eat that food. So that's something that we also need to put into play in this discussion over what we're doing. And, you know, as Richard had said, there are ways for us to be regenerative and sustainable in our agricultural production. And hopefully we can develop the policies to support producers, because there is a competitive pressure as well, as we're shifting over into these new production practices. Can we insulate our producers so that they are able to still remain competitive while they're doing that?
Thanks, Ashley. Well, yeah. So you've opened a box that I always dive into when we talk about food production, and that is food waste. So I'm just going to touch on that a little bit more. You know, so food waste's a problem in Canada. Over 2 million tons of food is wasted each year. Ashley's already touched on that. So what impact does food waste have on food prices, both nationally, but also for individuals, households, families, farms? So Ashley, anything to add on that one, seeing as though I've followed up with you?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the short, I don't think it does. There's definitely a missed opportunity, and there's cost associated with that lost opportunity of that food not being consumed, and that cost is an indirect cost that's experienced by everyone in the production chain, from producers to processors to the end household user. But in terms of a direct pricing influx, I don't think that it necessarily has an impact on the rising cost of food. From consumer behavior studies, we know that when we go into a grocery store, us as a consumer is more likely to purchase a loaf of bread from a full shelf than the empty shelf, because if there's only one loaf of bread left on that shelf, why didn't someone else want it? What's wrong with it? So we are just inherently our decision making is to go for the full shelf, and as Jason has noted, when it doesn't look like it is the most appealing, picturesque, perfect piece of produce, or of the best marbled meat, we don't choose it. So our retailers are overstocking to meet those consumer purchasing practices. And then when that food is deemed unsaleable, some of it is donated, which is great. And it does help address some of the food insecurity problems that we experience in those disadvantaged communities. But it's still a flaw in our system. Like we were talking previously about, those cracks that already exist. It's the same thing with food waste. 40% of the food that's produced in Canada for human consumption is never consumed. And almost half of that, about 47%, is happening directly at the household. It's not at the retailer. It's not at the processing or at restaurants. It's at our household consumption. So we are the problem.
Yeah. Richard, you were nodding away vigorously there.
Yes, no, I appreciate Ashley's overview there, and as she pointed out in our prep the other day, there's food waste, which occurs, as she just noted, at the household in large proportion, but back at the farm level in the produce sector, which I'm in, for example, our major crop, cauliflower, we leave about 30% of the product in the field for cosmetic reasons. Perfectly edible product is left behind and equates to food loss. And that, to Jason's question, I believe it was, that could be diverted into programs of some sort to get to people that need it for minimal cost, through various innovative programs that we could design. So it does affect our, as Ashley said, not maybe our costs directly, but there's, and we're talking monetary costs here, but there's social costs too, and people that are not eating healthily, there's social costs there, and healthcare costs, etc., that emanate from that we need to address. So if we could divert some of that food loss at farm level, it would be a win for society.
Thanks, Richard. Gordon, what about it from your angle?
Well, a little bit from our side is that food waste in a restaurant is a terrible thing, actually, because it's everything is, as they say, sliced and diced on the sheet, on the balance sheet, and so it really does add to the cost of operation. Enormous amounts of time and energy have been spent on trying to control food waste, and that's sometimes it's in the refrigeration, whether it's high or it's lower, it's the back of the freezer, the front of the freezer. Enormous amounts of studies have been done on that, and of course, there's also the whole idea of that when we're buying food that's presented to us is always perfect looking, and it doesn't have to be perfect looking to cook some things. We're to think about Richard with the cauliflower, it doesn't have to look perfect to cook, because when you cook it and do something with it and add the cheese and so on, it's quite fine on a plate. So there's other opportunities. So restaurants are paying a premium for pretty looking food, as opposed to having food that they can absorb into the food stream to control the cost. And loss is always the worst thing. And if we just take a look at COVID, there was probably 12 to 15 million dollars worth of lost food, most of which we donated to the food banks. But those that couldn't be, when we got shut down, that all that food was sitting in the freezer and it had to go. And every restaurant had 10, 12, $15,000 worth that all had to be gone. So, waste is very unfortunate, in particularly in our sector overall.
Okay. Do we have another question from the audience that we can take? Becky. So a crazy question, but as I'm understanding the reasons for the rising cost of food, will we ever see them go down after a period of time? Or will these new higher prices be here to stay? Who wants to start that one? Richard.
I believe they are here to stay, and I believe they are going to continue to go up, as much as I hate to say that. For outdoor agriculture, one of the driving forces on costs going forward is going to be climate change. Extreme weather events equal risk, and extreme rains flood out our crops, or et cetera, and that over time has to be factored into the cost structure. So unfortunately, I see a long time ahead with increasing food prices above base inflation. I'll put it that way.
Okay, Gordon.
Demute myself. So for our sector, I think what we experience, the only way food prices are going down, because if you look at a restaurant, what's core in a restaurant is protein. That's the core of the plate. That makes up the core of the meal. That makes up the core of the pricing overall. So the only way, predominantly, if you look back 25 years ago, meat was predominant protein. And it got cheaper because we moved to chicken. So we did drop the price a little bit, but then we moved to fish, and that dropped the price a little bit more, and we moved to pork, and that dropped a lot of price. That's the only way the price really happens, or if a new product is introduced to the marketplace. So we have plant-based meals now. So is the plant-based hamburger cheaper than the meat hamburger? The answer is yes, but that won't last long. That's only a temporary blip, and they'll be at the same price, or maybe it's going to even go higher, because the demand will drive it higher overall.
Okay. Ashley, anything to add?
Yeah. And it's not an answer I think people want to hear. But yeah, the cost of food is probably going to keep increasing. And no, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I say that with a grain of salt, because obviously we want people to have access to reliable, safe, and healthy food, obviously. But when we're thinking about it from the economic standpoint, the free market, anyway, is, it's supposed to balance out at that true or the ideal price within our supply and demand. And I feel like when we're taking into consideration, our inflation, as well as the environmental pressures that we're experiencing, as food prices increase, we're actually getting closer to that true price that we should have been paying all along for our food. The problem we have now is the rest of our expenditures have increased, so we don't really have that room to accommodate that new true price of food products. And to go back to what Gordon had mentioned about how they were able to substitute their proteins, we can still do that. We can still substitute in our own household diets and swap out different ingredients depending on what we're able to purchase at the time. Having that flexibility as well as planning ahead of time is really important. One of the reasons why Target didn't succeed in Canada is because they didn't realize how much Canadians love flyers. We love to shop the flyers, and that's part of that planning ahead, which can also really help when it comes to food waste. If you plan ahead, buy what you need, eat what you buy, and adopt some new alternative ingredients into your diet. Lentils are a fantastic, affordable protein opportunity. If your budget's a bit tight, buy some dried lentils or canned beans or whatever the case is, and integrate those different ingredients into your diet. We then run into the challenge of how do we know how to cook those things? But that's a whole other thing.
Okay. And we've got another audience question up on the screen here. So Trace McKenzie, what is our next step on the protein ladder? Is red meat consumption a thing of the past? We were discussing this before we went live, so I know there's lots of views and ideas here. So let's start with Richard.
I don't think it is. I'm not in the protein business, but in general terms, so ruminant agriculture, beef cattle, for example, are part of a crop rotation on a piece of ground, a field. That's part of a rotation that will keep that soil healthy in the long term. It's called regenerative agriculture type of principles, and you know, from a farm as we are non-livestock producers, we really need those ruminant livestock on our farm to build a sustainable soil health base to ensure our production of our horticultural crops in the long term. So in that sense, I hope that ruminant livestock is around for a long time. I recognize the plant-based proteins are coming on strong. The costs are coming down. They're going to get a slice of the marketplace. I think that's pretty well a given at this point. As they get to more scale and more market acceptance to plant-based protein, but I do feel that ruminant and other chicken, etc., will always be significant market share.
Thanks, Richard. Gordon, from your side.
Yeah. So beef will still be number one. I think for a long time yet. Certainly, I wouldn't say in my lifetime. Maybe my lifetime was not that long, but I certainly think it's going to be. And I think the predominant ones like certainly beef, chicken, fish, pork. These will be around for a long time. We'll have lots of other entrants into the marketplace, and they've already started. And a little bit like Ashley says, what we're seeing now too is a mixed diet in our culture. We're seeing a lot more influences from Africa and Asia. A lot more things now that we wouldn't see on menus. Our soup used to be a plain-based soup, and now you get a minestrone, which is basically a bean-based soup. In Africa, a lot of bean-based things, and so you're going to see a lot more of this in our culture. So it's going to be a little bit more diverse in the marketplace. The menus are getting more and more diverse all the time.
Okay, Ashley, anything else to add?
I agree with the other panelists. Red meat is, and the meat and potato diet is definitely culturally important to Canadians and has long been the tradition on many a grandparent and parent's plate. But we are, a multicultural nation, and we are seeing that integration more and more into our diet. And I think it's a beautiful thing that we're able to integrate that cultural diversity into our diet and provide us more options, because that option not only drives the efficiency in the production stage, but it also drives competition within the retailer stage. And that competition can help to shift some of that power to the consumer in terms of what's on offer, what the pricing is. And, there's that old saying that follow the money. And as consumers, we can place our vote with our dollar of where we're spending it and what we're spending it on. Red meat will probably become more of a treat as it's transitioned as our diets change. But
Okay. Do we have one more question from the audience? I see that time is ticking on. Dana, what role can greenhousing or other forms of less land-dependent farming have for contributing to large-scale production in order to keep produce more local throughout the year? Can transport costs be offset by developing more year-round local production in our cold climate? So I'm going to go to the producers first. Richard.
The short answer is yes. I think we need to look at that through the lens of life cycle assessment in terms of, the infrastructure and heating costs, et cetera, that it takes to produce crops in our off season, our winter season, for example. Some crops lend themselves, like leafy greens, for example, lettuces and so forth, lend themselves quite well to that type of production system. Whereas other crops are not so well suited by the nature of the agronomics that are involved with them. Again, I would go back to life cycle assessment. I think we want to look at it. The transport is part of the cost of getting a pound of food to the customer. It's significant, but it's when you start growing product inside of greenhouses and so forth, energy costs are quite significant and so on. So, in part, economics will sort that out. Economics is in some form a facsimile for environmental footprint to some degree, not 100% correlated, obviously, but somewhat. Energy, more energy equals more cost equals more environmental footprint. But again, I'd go back to life cycle assessment and, look at a particular product in that sense of compared to growing a product in the southern environment, transporting it, what's the total environmental footprint of that in comparison to producing it inside in a greenhouse or an inside structure, maybe not a greenhouse but an enclosed structure. So yes, it's already happening on our shoulder seasons now, like inside of greenhouses in our late fall and early spring. We're able to extend our season both ways, and with fairly relatively low cost structures that will extend that frost-free season out. But when you get into the dead of winter, you're talking fairly significant infrastructure and costs and heating, et cetera, that energy that sometimes it's actually probably more environmentally friendly to bring it from Florida or wherever, California. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Our time is short, and I really don't want to bring this to a close, but I'm going to have to. It's a fantastic conversation. But just quickly, I'm going to ask each one of you as we wrap up. Can I invite you to share your one top tip to reduce the amount people spend on food? Gordon.
I would say probably looking around, planning ahead is kind of the big thing for us. And I would say this on the average of restaurants too. That if you want to look at your menu, you need to look at the next quarter, what you're going to buy. Households should be looking 3-4 weeks, maybe even a month out, the kinds of foods that are available, seasonally adjusted. So planning ahead, I think, is the big one, and taking advantage of what those plans are.
Good sense there, Gordon. Thank you. Ashley, one top tip.
Flexibility with your grocery list. So be willing to make changes and adapt depending on what your price and budget is.
Thank you. And Richard.
I'll go against the business we're in, which is the fresh produce business, and I'd say you look to buy frozen, shelf stable type products, frozen berries, frozen fruit, veg, etc., that are perfectly healthy. They're captured at the peak of their quality, and they're frozen, flash frozen, and all the vitamins and nutrients are all there, and they're shelf stable, so you don't get the shrink at retail, which equals costs. So yeah, buy frozen fresh fruit and vegetables will help keep control costs.
Okay, and so our time is up, and so I want to thank all three of you, Richard, Gordon, Ashley, for being part of the panel this evening and for the excellent discussion. It's clear we haven't got all the solutions, but the important part is knowing what the problems and challenges are, and working together to find those solutions. I'd also like to thank the audience who've come in this evening, and asked wonderful questions. As I said, I could go on like this all night. It's just a fantastic, fascinating area. And I would like to thank Meet Your Farmer and Dalhousie University's Faculty of Agriculture for supporting this event this evening as well. So on that basis, I will say good night, and hopefully we will see you all again at another event sometime very soon. And don't forget, Canada Ag Day. Thank you, farmers. Thank the agricultural sector for putting that good quality, nutritious food on your table every single day. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.